So the big question is, how can entrepreneurs like us, women who face multiple barriers of knowledge, access, confidence, and availability, but are determined to bring ambitious ventures into the world, how can we master business and finance so we can maximize our impact in the world and yet remain true to our mission and to our values? That is the question. And this podcast will help you craft your own unique and powerful solution to this challenge. Hi, my name is Shubha Chakravarti, and this is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. How do you take your skills from a traditional career and transform them into the core of a monetizable business? How do you mine the experience, the contacts, and the tacit knowledge you've built up over years into a value-adding asset day one? And how do you find creative and enterprising ways to take care of important parts of the business, but that you really hate or aren't very good at? In this episode, journalist, author, and media business founder Elizabeth MacBride talks about how she leveraged her prior career, raised founder-fit funding, resourcefully navigated tough challenges and negotiations, and much more. Now, here's Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. This is great. You're somebody who comes from both the view of an entrepreneur as well as an expert who studies entrepreneurs like yourself and me. So very delighted to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So starting off, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what the Times of Entrepreneurship is about?
Yes. So I'm a business journalist. I've been a business journalist for more than 2 decades. So when I decided that really entrepreneurship was one of the vehicles that I believed could really make change in the world, I decided to launch a publication that would really focus on this early stage part of the economy. So Times of Entrepreneurship is a publication. People are have gotten unfamiliar with the concept of journalism these days, but we do journalism that covers the early stage economy. It's a media business.
So, you have this long background in journalism. I remember reading some of your excellent pieces on Wealthfront and stuff like that. But what gave you the business idea for this platform?
Well, it really started when years ago I was talking to people about why wasn't there more of a platform to write about the entrepreneurship movement. And at the time I thought maybe I'll just get a fellowship or figure out someone who would support me to do more freelance work. But eventually I started to see it as it could be a viable media business, right? Journalism has really consolidated in the past couple of decades, which is a big problem. But about maybe in the past 3 or 4 years, there have been some viable media businesses started. And I thought if there's one space that looks like it could be viable as a business and do important journalism, it's kind of early stage entrepreneurship.
So now you have this idea, you have the concept, you've seen it potentially work out as a business. What paths did you consider to bring it to life, and how did you decide which path to take?
Well, I feel like that's an ever-evolving decision-making process.
Isn't it for us all?
Yeah, exactly, right? For me, it really became possible because I pitched the idea to the Kauffman Foundation, and that was way back in the spring of 2019. And they liked the idea, asked me to submit an application for a sponsorship. It's a for-profit company, but foundations these days have also been doing sponsorships of for-profit companies. So really, that's the avenue I took. I needed a little bit of seed funding to get it off the ground, and that was an $80,000 sponsorship from the Kauffman Foundation.
You have your grant or the sponsorship. What are the first steps you took? Like, what tactically did you do next?
So this is not my first startup. I've been involved in probably a total of maybe a half dozen, right? LLCs and other media businesses, a couple of hugely successful tech companies. You mentioned Wealthfront. I joined Wealthfront pretty early on in that company's evolution. This was the first one I had started, but one thing that I knew about myself was that if I didn't get kind of the back end systems in place in a way that really could work, I'm talking about the accounting, filing the corporation paperwork. I wanted to get that in place in ways that I had to think about it very, very little as I was going forward. So that's what I worked on first, for the first month or so, was getting that stuff in order.
And sounds like that turned out to be a good thing for you because it freed up your mind space to focus on what you're.
Yeah. I just think it's really important, especially the accounting, right? I think some people do that well and naturally, but I don't. And so I pay about $200 a month for a bookkeeping service called Bench. But for me, it's well worth it, right? Because it just plugs in to my bank account and it's easy. And then my payroll service is Gusto. I made myself an employee of the company. And that turned out to be a very wise move in retrospect, because what happened to Times of E, which has really been both a blessing and a curse, but I launched it. So that second thing I did after I got everything in order, right, is that I built sort of a scratch website, a prototype website with a designer who's in Malaysia. And I thought, well, $80,000 is not that much money, but let me just put something up. It'll help me get more sponsorships. So I put it up in mid-February of 2020.
Before the pandemic.
Right before the pandemic, February 12th. Like if I had been launching a month later, I might not have launched, right? But I had this kind of prototype website up and running, and the pandemic hit. And I thought, well, I know how to do journalism. There's clearly a big need for reporting on this space right now, because all of the other publications, if you think back to that time, were really focused on health, as they rightly should have been, right? Mm-hmm. But some of the business impacts were not being covered in the ways that they should have been. And so we jumped right into that, and we did some really important coverage, including an op-ed piece in CNBC based on our work that the Senate used to reshape the PPP.
Great. That must have felt pretty good.
It did. As we've evolved over the past couple of years, we've turned into a small but influential, I'm happy to say, publication. We have a ways to go to be profitable or as big as we need to be, but that was great in a lot of ways, although terrifying, right? Those early days of the pandemic were really scary. Right?
For sure. So we talked about funding, and what you laid out just now was supremely helpful in clarifying, the nitty-gritty of it. You talked about the seed funding from the Kauffman Foundation. Was there any other aspect of funding that you considered that you think would be instructive for people who are following in that path to know?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, I am very familiar with the world of venture capital from writing about it and have good friends who are venture capitalists. I've talked to probably a dozen venture capitalists, but at the moment, I am not actively pursuing that as a funding model. That could change. But, one of my friends said to me, what you take on when you take on investors is really expectations. And again, this comes back to what I know about myself. I do not like other people deciding what I need to do. And so I'm not really pursuing that. I think there's way too much pursuit of it. I think especially women have such a small chance of landing the funding, and the amount of time you have to spend working on that, I just think, why not get your business up and running? But that's my perspective on it. And it comes definitely, I think, for women that are at least my age, right? I think it's a little easier for women in their 20s to raise funding for VCs. But I did end up doing a very small friends and family round. And so that is I think, a worthwhile endeavor for people. This was how the pandemic was somewhat of a blessing. There were all of those programs that enabled small businesses to draw grants and loans. Yes, I tapped into those as well. Yeah, my decision to put myself on the payroll and to be very formal about incorporating the company was key to that, because I had all the paperwork I needed to get the loans and the grants.
And I'm really glad you're talking about that, because in many cases, not all, it seems to be the most boring part, and people tend to say, well, let's not worry about that. So it's great that you did it and it actually worked out for you.
Yeah.
And that you talked about a friends and family round of funding, which leads to the natural question, right? Because whenever we talk about investment, we're talking about value. How do you value a company? Leaving aside the question of specifics, what I'm more interested in is, how did you think about your business value?
Well, so the friends and family round was really just a friend of mine saying, and this again was in the pandemic, hey, I like the work you're doing. I want to support it. How can I be part of it? And so I went to my venture capital friends and said, what should I do? And they said, well, use a SAFE. So a SAFE is sort of a vehicle for attaching a future value to something that really has no value. And you can look it up online. It's called SAFE. It's just a safe there. And it's a pretty simple document. You could just download it. You have to hire a lawyer to help you make sure that it fits who you are, who your business is, but it's easy to find online. So that's what I use to base my friend's investment in the company.
And you mentioned a lawyer. So did you actually go out and get a business lawyer? And if so, what worked for you and what pointers would you give?
I did. Yeah, I did go and get an attorney. I got it through a friend of mine, actually a high school friend, recommended a kind of general business attorney that he had used. So my attorney ended up being a guy named Chris Jacques, and he helped me a ton in the early days, sort of figure out both that safe issue, talk about name and ownership issues for the company.
And on that topic, did you take a legal view or take some legal steps to protect your intellectual property? So two things in particular: your trademarks, times of fees and name, and it has value and will have more value over time. And obviously your written outputs and any other media outputs. How did you think about protecting the business value of that?
I didn't probably think about it enough. I'll be honest with you. Things happened so quickly in those days that two of the things I'm doing now are really thinking more consciously about the brand and its value, and thinking more consciously about the website, which is very related. Remember, I said I put up a Scratch website in the beginning? It still is the Scratch website. The pandemic just happened and things were so kind of up in the air. And then I published a book. So the past 2 years have gone by faster than I realized.
Great book, by the way. I'd recommend it to every entrepreneur.
It's called The New Builders. You can find it on Amazon. And
love it. It's interesting because my next interview this afternoon is going to be with an IP lawyer. So I just triggered the question. It's like, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So it sounds like from a legal and financial angle, you recognize the importance of those, and you also recognize that those would not be the best uses of your time or your talent. So the big takeaway for me was, find a good person you trust, find them early, and then trust them to do their job.
Yeah, I am a single mother and a writer. And yeah, you have to know yourself well, I think, to succeed in most things, and especially in being a business person, because it really is about maximizing your time.
So now you have kind of the building blocks in place. What steps did you take to put the business on a solid footing while you were delivering on your mission, which is to write about early stage entrepreneurship?
Well, what steps did I take? I mean, that's the part that I really feel like is a work in progress still, because we have not yet come up with a successful business model for the company. I think there is one in reach, and we're close, and we've had our first cash flow positive month.
Congratulations. It's huge.
Thank you.
Not celebrated enough in the venture capital heavy world.
Yeah, no, it was good. I mean, we've really been sustained by foundation support, but we do have clients. It's just that we don't have enough clients for our work to make us profitable. And I don't particularly like relying on these big sponsorships from the foundations. I hope they continue. There's no reason to think they won't. But still, I'd like to have this more as an operating business. So what we're doing now is launching an events business where it's a little bit easier to sell sponsorship. So right now, we're doing what we call bespoke research, which is sort of like white papers and content for companies. And then in addition, we're doing an events, selling sponsorships of events and of the website and newsletter.
So it sounds like it's leveraging every aspect of your prior skills and background to generate cash flow that you can then use to buy yourself some runway to make this new venture an operating business.
Yeah, I can tell you're like a business mind. I appreciate that. I could not have articulated that that's what I'm doing, but yeah, that's what I'm doing.
I'm trying to extract the lessons because it's useful to me, and I'm sure it'll be useful to others as well.
Yeah.
It's a good segue. You talked about, how you're trying to establish revenue streams. This foundations as a revenue source is great, but it's a bit lumpy. And it's a bit potentially unpredictable, right? You don't have a right to kind of go back and demand. How do you then think about your customers, which could be the foundations, right? And your consumers, which could be entrepreneurs, people like me. I don't know if there are other groups of people that you're targeting with your content. How do you think about these two different groups and keeping them both happy?
Yeah, it's a challenge. People don't recognize it necessarily, but media businesses are like the original platform businesses, right? They've always had different groups of customers that they had to serve at one time. How do I think about it? As I've learned to be a little bit more of a publisher versus the hands-on journalist, my attention is focused much more on the people who are responsible for our cash flow. So that is keeping the foundations happy. It's making relationships with businesses who want to sponsor or want to reach the audience we're building on Times of E. So it's those two key constituencies, and then our investors. So the one or two that we do have for my friends and family round have become a bigger part of my time. So I think of them as sort of my job. And then I'm able to outsource and hire the work that I really love, actually. So it does hurt a little bit because the work I really love is the hands-on journalism, but that's work that can be done by other people. The work I have to do is the sales and the relationship management of the big clients.
It's funny because I was interviewing a lady who's a finance specialist, but she's now running a company that drives early cancer detection. So she said, I had to fire the financial part of me and be the CEO. So it sounds like you had to fire the operational journalist part of you and become more of the CEO to make sure that the business continues to be viable. And that may be a challenge, not just for you, for me, for virtually everybody who wants to try to become an entrepreneur, because you get in because you love something, and then you find that to be a successful business person, you actually have to step away from that a bit. Is that consistent with your experience?
Oh, yeah, I would say that. I think that's been very true of my experience. And it's really hard because it is both what I love to do, and also I'm like the name behind the company, right? So when I do write a piece, and I try to set aside a day a week to write and continue to write. And every week I write a short introduction to my newsletter. So I'm still in the game, and it's still very impactful when I do that work. So it's just an ongoing challenge balancing that.
That's one of my favorite parts, by the way. I love the introduction.
Oh, thank you.
I open it just to make sure I don't miss it. I love everything else, but I don't want to miss the introduction. You can tell that you're a journalist. It's very clear. So great. So now we talked about, you have to keep these customers happy and both sets of constituent customers happy. And then as you think about revenue and pricing, what basis do you use to think about those, and what principles, guideposts do you use to help make those decisions about pricing? And
it's an interesting question, right? Because I remember reporting years ago on a company that helped other companies figure out their pricing. I have a sales director who works with me on a commission basis, and he's really been a great help in figuring out kind of what the norms are. There are definitely CPM rates attached to online media businesses, but we've basically thrown those out the window, right? People that want to support Times of E are really supporting journalism, are really supporting these concepts of diversity and entrepreneurship, impact in the early stage economy. Those ideas and getting associated with them are really what they're supporting. So pricing that is really just a question of what we think they'll bear. So that's basically how we've been setting the prices so far.
Great. So I picked up two very interesting things, by the way. Number one was clearly that you recognized and acquired professional help. So a salesperson, a big part of it is knowing what the market will bear. How did you find this person, and how did you decide that they were the right person for your business, especially given this impact angle?
So I think this is a great strength that women entrepreneurs have, which is we've got these fantastic networks. I found our sales director, Adam Schaefer is his name, through a friend of mine, whose name is Marjorie Connor. So that's just what happened. And I looked around in the beginning, reached out to a couple of other salespeople that I knew to see if they might have ideas. But again, probably partly because of the pandemic, Adam worked out because he was really good, and also because he had the time in his schedule beyond his day job. So he works for us part-time.
So it works out for him, it works out for you, and you don't have to bear the full overhead of a full-time salesperson. So
right, exactly. So it's a good fit for now. As we grow, as I hope we grow, there will be some other solution. But in terms of sales, you can hire outside sales organizations. So he could eventually be a director working with those people. There are other solutions for sales these days.
And the way you became familiar with them was how it's just kind of being around the block and knowing all the stuff you know about entrepreneurship, or how did you learn about all that?
Well, this is an advantage of being a journalist. So whenever I have a question about something that's going to require more than like a Google search, I usually try and do a story about it. Right. So that's how I generally learn about things. I can't remember if I actually wrote a story about sales, but reaching out to people to say, hey, can I talk to you for 15 minutes about this is not a hard thing for me to do these days.
Gotcha. So that's where you have an inherent advantage of maybe over people who don't have that.
Right. But I think you can still ask, right? You can still say, do you have 15 minutes where I can pick your brain about this?
Which naturally comes to the question of networks, right? You mentioned networks, and I found that interesting because there's two angles. Women are natural connectors for sure. But on the other hand, there's a lot of research that says that one thing that's holding women entrepreneurs back is they don't have access to the right networks. The networks of people who have money, the venture capitalists, as you mentioned. It's maybe the people who have the advice, the prior entrepreneurial experience, who can say, hey, don't forget to hire a sales director or whatever the case may be. What is your experience on the what I'll call the non-traditional side, the financial side of accessing networks? Have you been able to do that? And what advice or learnings have you had for others who might want to break into those networks?
I think this is really hard. I remember once I went to the Kennedy Center and saw Samantha Bee. She's like a late night comedian. And somebody in the audience said, hey, how can I do what you're doing? And she got up and said, well, I did 15 years of low paid stand-up comedy for like $100 a night before I got to where I am, which I feel like is sort of, in terms of networks, it's like kind of my answer too, right? I mean, I started 20 years ago building up very rich networks as a journalist. So like, you can't just invent that wholesale. You have to work with what you have based on your career and your life path. My guess is just that what you have is richer than you realize for women.
And how would you go about discovering the richness, like if you're starting out?
I think maybe a basic step if you're a woman entrepreneur is really just sitting down and thinking about who you know. And I don't think women tend to look at relationships in terms of their richness and how they can leverage them. So maybe sitting down and just writing down, okay, these are the people I know. What do they really, how could they help me in this? It's not that you're going to ask them for a huge amount of work or money unless it's right to do that. But just to sit down and think about what you have in your network is a really good start.
And then through your experience of writing a New Builders, are there other, I don't want to say tips or tricks, but any other less obvious ways that non-traditional entrepreneurs can use to break into these power networks if they don't have success through their?
Well, the one we haven't mentioned so far is an accelerator or an incubator, which the star of our book, Danaris Mazzara, was able to do, right? She tapped into one called Entrepreneurship for All. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, I spoke at an event with New York Women in Business, which is affiliated with SCORE, which is a network run by the SBA. So there are vehicles, and there are often community centers in your community that will have more access than you realize to angel investors. Like retired business executives really love to help other up and coming entrepreneurs. They really love to do it. So you just find the organization in your community, and that's another way you can tap into a different network.
Gotcha. And did you need to use them at all, given that you already have all of this?
I haven't so far, but I'll tell you, yesterday I just submitted Times of E for a pitch competition. So what I have tapped into is not really an accelerator so much as a friend of mine runs the Miller Center at Berkeley. So she just threw Times of E's profile out to their mentor network. And so I got an ad hoc mentor that way, and he's been hugely helpful. His name's Brett Waters. So he talks me through some hard stuff.
Gotcha. So switching gears slightly, right? So we're now kind of coming back to the finance track. That was a very rich vein to explore. So how do you think about finances and managing the finances of your business day to day? Like, do you delegate it completely? Do you keep one or two numbers in front of you? How do you look at that?
I think I'm still learning that piece, honestly. So I have this bookkeeper, and there are monthly reports issued with that. I keep pretty close tabs on the bank account and look at that, every couple of days. I have a budget that I'm working from. I think what I'm not great at yet, but what I'm working on is incorporating the knowledge of that budget into my kind of day-to-day schemes so that I can understand how the cash flow in any given week is affecting our goals for the month. For instance, today I'm thinking about bringing on a marketing firm. So I'll probably today or tomorrow take a look at the budget and say, okay, this is the amount that I know we are set to spend. If I add this much every month going forward, what does that do to our sales goals? So it's adjusting in that way.
Sounds like you not only keep control of your budget, but you can even ask, is it worth the dollars? Because you can say, I need to see X amount of sales for me to justify spending, I don't know, 4 or 5,000, whatever the case might be, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So it's kind of sounds like it gives you a double benefit. Did you feel any like internal qualms, and did you have to get over, a lot of people face dread when they think about finances, and it's like, oh, do I have to look at this? Did you face any of that? And if so, how do you overcome that when it comes to financial matters?
I like money. I'm not super motivated by money, but I've always had a good time like getting things to work, right? To me, it's sort of like a puzzle. So I did not feel that dread. I'm not good at keeping track of like the day-to-day expenses and writing all that down. But what I do like is the aspect of finance where you're piecing a puzzle together to say, okay, if our revenue is going to be X and our expenses are Y, like how do we make that all work? And over these months. So that's kind of fun for me, honestly. And there's so many tools to do it now. Excel and your bank account attaches to this and that. It's not bad. I think people have an emotional relationship with money sometimes that will keep them from using it, from seeing it as the tool it actually is. And I don't think I have that issue, so that's helpful.
So I'm getting the sense that you kind of used what you like, which is your strength, and side edged your way into something versus doing what everybody says you should do, which is like the boring, step by step.
Is that right? I don't know.
I'm a CPA. What do I know?
Well, I just do it the way it works for me, right?
Did you ever do a business plan? Like, how did you set the direction? Did you just kind of go by instinct?
Well, the Kauffman Foundation in their sponsorship application was fairly detailed. So that sufficed for a business plan.
And do you use that? Did you find yourself going back to that ever? Or was it kind of like, I'm done, got the money, let's move?
I think I probably would have if the pandemic hadn't hit.
Oh, yes,
right?
That upended everything, right?
It upended everything. I had a plan. And then when the pandemic hit, I just thought, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, the first thing I need to do is conserve cash. So I think for the first maybe 3 or 4 months, I wrote every single story on the site, which was beyond exhausting. I don't even remember exactly how I managed to do it. Yeah, so that upended any kind of business plan. I was just reflecting on this today. I think now I'm at the point now where I'm like, okay, now I need to go back to the business plan or come up with a new business plan, which is one of the reasons that I put us in for this accelerator pitch competition yesterday, just because I think we need to get centered on how we're going to grow.
You're almost reading my mind. So what are your plans for growth?
What are my plans for growth? I mean, events, right? So we are on a track to do, I hope, 3 events in 2022. So the first one will be a virtual event for university entrepreneurship professionals and professors. We've lined up a great speaker, which is Stacey Vanek Smith, who wrote Machiavelli for Women. So that's one event. And then there's another I have in mind for May, and then an in-person event centered around women and finance in September. So those are really the plans for growth for next year.
So it feels like it's a strategy that's focused on getting a foundation set in the event space, building off of your name in the content space, and then kind of exploring further expansions from that space.
Yeah, that's right. I think one thing that women entrepreneurs have to keep in mind is that they shouldn't talk too much about their plans for the future. I think women more than men are vulnerable to people stealing their ideas.
You think so?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Why is that the case?
I don't know, but I've seen it happen a lot. So I think it's a thing. I think it's true, right?
I trust your instinct on this, given your experience, but I had never thought about that. It's actually good caution for me to, and I think for many more women, because I think there's a chance that you come up with an entrepreneurial idea because there's a problem that you see that hasn't been solved and by itself.
Yeah.
It has protectable aspects to it. Great. Thank you for that. And then talking about this aspect of women versus male entrepreneurs, I just want to touch on a slightly different aspect, which is, this part around negotiation and showing up with credibility with hard audiences like bankers or what have you. How has your experience been? Like, how would you rate yourself as a negotiator? How important is it? And what has been most useful to you in encountering those or navigating those successfully?
I think I would rate myself as poor on the negotiation side.
There's two of us.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for women and for me particularly. Well, what I mostly try and do is get someone else to do it, right? Although that doesn't always work. There is a woman in my network who's really, really good at negotiating. That's my friend Elaine, and we pitch business together.
Pofeld?
Yeah, Elaine Pofeld, yeah.
Yes.
So when we pitch work together, she handles most of the negotiation because she's better at it than I am. Like, she keeps a cooler head. Beyond that, I also rely on my sales director. Again, I outsource it because I think it's just not a natural gift that I have.
And I'm wondering if you're kind of unconsciously making a calculation that paying them for a skill that they bring to the table is in the long run cheaper than trying to cut down on that expense and, losing out on the elephant,
Yeah, probably I'm unconsciously doing. Yeah, again, it comes back to just knowing yourself, right? I know my strong points and my weak points, and that's a weak point. So I try very hard these days to be reactive more than proactive in financial situations.
That's interesting. It's the opposite of what I would have expected. Tell me more.
This is a new realization that I'm having, but I think one of women's problems in the world is we don't recognize our own value. People will see us as more valuable than we see ourselves.
So don't anchor yourself too low is
right.
What I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's, I guess, the economic concept there is don't anchor yourself too low. And I think women just in reaching out automatically anchor themselves too low. So even sometimes I'll just try and be reactive. I don't have a clearer way to say it than that, but wait for people to come to me to ask me to do things. That's automatically a better position. And if I'm entering into a negotiation with someone, trying to be slow about it. And just waiting for them to make a move. So I feel like I know what they're thinking before I make a move.
It's fascinating. I think that's one of the gems that I'm definitely going to have to pull out and showcase a bit. This has been a fascinating discussion on the negotiation aspects. But more broadly, if you step back and say, okay, I'm an entrepreneur and I'm a woman, how has this being a woman shaped your entrepreneurial journey? Like, what would you say is the impact? Like, how did that shape your journey?
In every way, because I think the reason I'm an entrepreneur is because I'm a single mother. The flexibility was hugely important to me as I was raising my two daughters. So that is why I started my own company, essentially, along with the other reasons that we've talked about. And then beyond that, one of the reasons I'm interested in having Stacey speak at our event is that I really disagree with some of the things she said in Machiavelli for Women about keeping silent about being a mother, because I never did that. And I think in many ways it actually helped my career. It might have hurt it in ways I don't recognize too, but I think mostly it helped it. So it's just very core to who I am, right? Balancing my work with my children has been a big part of that. And entrepreneurship has enabled me to do it.
Would you feel comfortable talking about an example of how it helped you to be open that you are a mother?
Well, so part of being a journalist, and I think actually part of being a woman raising money or establishing a business, is being likable and relatable. And so I often will take my kids when I can, when they can miss school or when they don't have school. They've often accompanied me on reporting trips, which automatically creates some sympathy, I think, with whoever I'm with. So there are some people, and I think the argument in Machiavelli for women is that you don't want that kind of sympathy, but I've always found it helpful. And I think it depends probably on the kind of business you're in, right? You don't want to go into your doctor's office and see their kids like they're not, you don't want them to be like multitasking on your.
Donnie, stop doing that. Yeah, you were saying.
Right. Right. But being a journalist, it's been easier being a journalist and a publisher and a media person. Yeah.
So what's your vision if all your wildest dreams came true for the times of entrepreneurship, which I hope they do? What will that world look like?
I have said from the beginning that I want to create a competitor to the Wall Street Journal. 50 years from now, we should be a publication that really has redefined and looks at business in a different way. And
that different way being, how would you characterize that?
We look at the impact on individuals and communities, not just institutions, and we care about more than profit.
So it's a triple bottom line view of journalism versus triple bottom line view of business.
Yeah.
I love it. It's fascinating. And any words of wisdom for other women who might want to start media businesses like you?
Well, maybe don't do it. I think media businesses are very hard. They are becoming more viable, but they're still very hard. Starting a business in general, I think, is a great thing to do, though. So my advice for starting a business in general is just get the funding first. Have a little bit of funding first before you launch.
Do you have any mileposts or any kind of markers for how much is enough?
Like for me, it's always been 3 months of cash.
Of operating expenses.
Yeah.
So if you had payroll, rent, all of that included, at least 3 months before you take the first step.
Right.
And then I'm going to ask one wrinkle on that question. You know, you're a new builder. I'm a new builder. We're not the traditional white male 20-year-old. Is there anything you'd add if you were a new builder or in particular a second career, what I call a second career entrepreneur, where you've already done some other stuff and now you're coming into the entrepreneurship fold?
I don't know if there's anything I'd add. I think probably the advice that plays the most to people like us is that we have more riches than we know in our network, because our networks are bigger, right? Probably we've both forgotten a lot of people who could help us at this point in our careers. So spending some time thinking about that could be useful. And, you know, the other thing I just would say is just do it, right? I have reflected a lot on the fact that it's good to be an entrepreneur at this age because I do have some perspective on it, right? When I think about, oh, what if the business doesn't work? What if my goals if I don't meet my goals? I have the perspective to know it's not the end of the world. So my identity is not entirely wrapped up in the company. A big chunk of it is, but it's not like if I were 35 and doing this.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that really thoughtful and enlightening conversation. As I reflected on what Elizabeth shared in that great chat, a few things really stood out for me. The most inspiring for me was her vision of creating a Wall Street Journal, but for the new builder, early stage entrepreneurial economy. That's catchy, vivid, and incredibly clear, both to herself as a guide to action, but also to communicate to others what she and the Times of E are about. Second, she's shown tremendous wisdom and pragmatism in initially exploring all avenues of financing, but ultimately sticking to those that fit best with her mission and her desire for autonomy. She understood and managed that trade-off really skillfully. Last but not least, I learned a lot from the confidence with which she tackled areas she wasn't comfortable with, like negotiation, and the resourcefulness she used in leveraging strengths to manage other areas like finances, which were not in her wheelhouse. To do this, she leaned on her strengths, her experience, and her network. If you're a second career entrepreneur, this can be your huge and hidden superpower because chances are you care more about getting the job done than about what anyone thinks about you. So looking at where you are today, what prior life and professional experiences can you mine for fun and profit? And how can you put those to work for the vision that's driving you forward? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.